Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca, all the way from Mexico City, with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson. We're online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our site in the episode notes. You can also find my personal social media handle as at Don Eduardo Barca. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. We have merch as well. If you like a shirt, you could contact us through our site at what'sleftpodcast.com, and Andy will mostly follow up with you. Thank you. All right, welcome back, Eric Heinze from London, professor of law and humanities at Queen Mary University of London, known for his sharp analysis of free speech, human rights, and political theory. His books include The Most Human Right and Hate Speech and Democratic Citizenship, and his writing appears in outlets like The Guardian and Eon and other works. His new book is Coming Clean, The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left, which we discussed in an episode prior to this, and we look forward to this discussion, Reform or Revolution, with Eric Heinze. Thank you, Eric. Professor Eric, actually, I should say. How would you like to be addressed? I think I had this question.
Eric is fine.
All right, let's see. Andy?
Yeah, so when we when we had completed our first episode with Coming Clean, I was sending Eric an email thanking him for doing this, and I thought it was a great episode. And then he wrote, "Thanks so much, Andy, to both you and Eduardo. Great stuff." And he said, "It's all copied and posted." He wrote, "As we were talking, and after the should Eduardo vote query, I was struck at how rare it was today to hear people today, after Clinton Blair transformation, still argue for total overhaul." He said, "Perhaps someday we can talk up the old reform or revolution debate." And then he wrote, "I'd say that until Clinton, it was still a common debating point, but only scarcely hear it today." Well, anyway, that's just a thought. And I don't think Eric knew that, but once he sent me an email with the words reform or revolution, like I was like a pit bull latching right onto it. I was like, we have to talk about this. And I particularly actually liked the angle that you brought up, Eric, which I don't think you knew that I was going to be so interested in this topic necessarily, but talking not just of the question of, oh, do we agree with reform or revolution, which we might talk about today, but your notion of historically, and we talked a little bit about just at the beginning of the episode, but historically how this has been such an important debate, and yet it seems to have ended. I think that's interesting to talk about. So I'm just going to give you the floor now and start where you want. But I will say that just even talking about I agree with you, I think, but talking about the notion of where this debate came from, how it's been important, and how it kind of went away, and maybe even why, that's an interesting question for me. And so I wanted to start that here, if you would.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it was interesting. The only thing that made me think about it was, again, this entirely peripheral remark that you almost kind of just dropped, Andy, in our last discussion, right? When you had said that you're slowly getting Eduardo not to vote anymore. And so I felt that at some point we were going to have kind of like, the angel and the devil on your shoulders kind of fighting over Eduardo's soul. And so, right. And, no, just as we were also, discussing earlier, I think that dates are always arbitrary. I would tend to debate what we would call, the contemporary left, kind of back to the French Revolution or French American, around that, late 18th century period. And then really in the 19th century, because at that same time, right, capitalist economics, really start to expand in the 19th century, right? We get the formation of the urban proletariat, and all economies are restructured. And so I think it's really at that point that we can start speaking about what today, the tradition that we're still talking about when we talk about the left or progressive thought or what have you. And again, as we were saying before, but even before that, but already earlier in the 18th century, before these revolutions, the French, the Americans, if had taken place, these were hot topics, right? Britain remained a constitutional monarchy on the view that, and also not least because of the horror of the terror in France, right? But even before, Voltaire, decades before the French Revolution, was already praising the British system, finding it to be, at least compared to other European monarchies, relatively able to progress organically. And so on that analysis, it was maybe least surprising that Britain never did have a revolution. And again, which many on the left in Britain have regretted to this very day. Right? Believe me, there are plenty of them. For Voltaire, it was a plus. Not for everybody. And of course, the French took a different view. They entirely overthrew what you might say was actually one of history's more successful monarchies. The French monarchy in the 70s. There were worse. There were worse than the French one. Nevertheless, that point itself was interesting because so much, I think, of that revolutionary period, and in America as well, despite what some of the rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence, I don't think it's that French and British monarchies were so despotic. That really became the revolutionary story, right? But yes, they were absolutists. They tossed their political rivals in jail. So they were nothing. They did not necessarily have a lot to admire today. But nevertheless, compared to some other states, they were, the economies were growing. There was reasonable stability. Their idiotic wars existed, but within, I mean, you can look at it in many ways. It's very hard to look back and pass judgment. The only point I'm trying to make now is that there are reasons why this debate has been around for a very, very long time. And then once we get into the 19th century, again, a lot of what Karl Marx is writing. Often he's more vicious with fellow socialists than he is with a capitalist, right? For he can kind of explain capitalism in a very systematic way. But when it comes to, these other people who think that, again, we can just reform it piecemeal, and then later on with Ewald Bernstein, who was the founder of the German Socialist Party, again, he became a very influential proponent in France as well. With Jaurès, you had these people who were starting to make very convincing arguments that that the system did seem reformable, that reforms could be made, and then by the time we get into the kind of into the 20th century, when socialist revolutions actually happen, and some millions of lives are lost, I think that was the beginning of the end. And yet, I would say certainly into the 60s and 1970s, I would argue it was still a debate, right? Maybe the concept of what a revolution had to be was not what it was in 1917 by the time we get to the 60s or 70s, but I don't think it was a dirty word on the left. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think it's really starting, the kind of the neoliberalism with Reagan, then Clinton, Blair, Thatcher, Blair, right? That you really see the idea, the idea that talking about revolution would be silly, that the system is there and you have to work with it how best you can. I think that's the message of Clinton and Blair in a nutshell. How whatever you understand the system to be. Today, you'll still find people who would call themselves revolutionaries, but I just don't think I don't think that they really structure debate. And certainly, I mean, I tend to see them more as academics, quite frankly, or as very marginal figures, and not the ones that really drive the debate, not the ones who have become a point of reference in the way that I think you could still sometimes find as late as the 60s or 70s.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I don't think I think me and Eduardo still, we actually regularly say, well, look, this is not going to work unless we have a revolution. When we raise the different problems that we raise on the show, we always come back. We often come back to, like, we don't think this is going to change without some sort of deep structural change that is not going to happen piecemeal or evolution in an evolutionary way, but something abrupt and disruptive and, democratic and mass based. So we use that term revolution. I don't think we do it from academic, but I can say we are marginal. I agree with you on that. I don't. If it's talked about, it's almost only talked about in a cute way up in academia, kind of in there, and then I don't actually think it has a meaningful discussion within, like, the working class or everyday's life, like it's a tug of war between teenagers and their parents, like talking about what kind of change could happen in the way that I remember hearing, like, you'll know better than I do, certain Russian literature talked about, back when there was the folks the anarchists who would go to the countryside and argue with their parents about, like, no, I'm going there. We're going to make the revolution. We're going to go to the peasants and make it happen. And I think it was, I can't remember which Russian. I'm a big fan of Russian lit. I just can't remember the author's name, of people who would argue with their parents about the need for that kind of change. And I do think that was even probably something that was happening in the 60s and 70s. Although, like you said, it was about, again, maybe even a countryside discussion of, like, can we go with armed guns, like, and go to the people in the countryside and come in and, like, make it so that land is redistributed and things like that, like the Vietnamese struggle, the struggles in South America, Nicaragua, and things like that. I think its center of axis kind of became out of the urban centers and more one of something that happened on the periphery, but then maybe had to be kind of brought to the cities. But I am really struck when you mentioned the Clinton period that the talk of revolution kind of died. I mean, and now as you talk, I think I would currently locate that the end of that discussion as coming with the fall of the Soviet Union, and the sense that as many problems as were occurring in socialism that people talked about in China or North Korea or the former Soviet Union, and people had identified those, and there were reformists who had said, hey, the bad things that came with Stalin and things like that, they would no longer just try to hide them, but they would talk more about them, but say they're going to try to make a change. I think many revolutionaries thought of this former Soviet Union in its state in the 50s and 60s and 70s and then 80s as a form of socialism. I don't, but they did. And when that died, and that was truly, for most people, that was truly existing socialism. That was truly the revolutionary alternative with all its problems. And I think that dream died then. And from my vantage point, I'll just say that's unfortunate that people thought that that's what we were fighting for, because I believe that that's one of the reasons why it is so hard to resurrect revolution, because when you talk about it, people think you're talking about this state-run, top-down thing, and I'm not. I do mark my tradition in Marxism and even in what the initial Bolsheviks do, but also in the initial actions of the Spanish Revolution that never took power and things like that. The kind of from below fighting for democracy, if you will, but it's a fight. I mean, it's a fight. It's not pacifist. That will have to happen and will have to be mass-based to end these problems. Which, again, I think I know that your Coming Clean is really about saying, hey, we have to note the crimes that occurred with truly existing socialism in North Korea and China and Soviet Union. And I agree with you. But I think it's also can't forget that the revolutions that happened in Russia stopped a war, distributed land, did do things like it came out of a desire to end millions and millions being killed in capitalist war, and were successful in that. And then I would say, by virtue of how things progressed, ultimately turned its guns on its own people in some way, shape, or form. And I wonder if people think there is no alternative in the way that Thatcher, or who was it? No, Blair said, largely because they don't necessarily like what they have here, but they think that the alternative leads directly to some other way of getting to that same bad place. And I would agree. Like, why would one fight? It's like what we were talking about when me and Brandy are doing apartment hunting. Why are we going to leave one house with mold in its walls just to go to some other place with potentially mold in its walls? And that's what I do believe, that people have kind of unfortunately come to the conclusion that there is no alternative to the system, that you can just, because the alternative leads to the same place. And that's me why one of my thoughts on why people have just stopped even talking about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess a couple of points. I mean, some of these points are really difficult, and particularly some of the historical ones. But in a sense, it's difficulties that you can't shy away from because they're the difficulties that are part of this core question. Um, Again, right? I mean, Andy, I think you rightly acknowledge the abuses of the Soviet Union, and I think your characterization in many ways is very good. Certainly by 70s, 80s, I would say it was really Western leftists, or I would even say just kind of and West or just kind of non-Soviet, kind of, in other words, it was leftists who were not living under the Soviet thumb or in other very repressive communist regimes who tended to look at it most positively. I think there's good reason to think that, certainly by the 70s and 80s, very few people in the Soviet Union really believed any of this stuff, and at least this is something right, that it's really the West and other people who were not actually living in that kind of system, who were tending to idealize it, and who, as you would say, they would acknowledge the Stalinism and all that. By the 70s or 80s, you couldn't really deny it anymore, but they would say, yes, well, look at the West, just as bad, and if you believe that one can make progress, why don't you believe the other can make progress? So I think generally, you captured that correctly. But I think we should be under no illusion that that in the East by the 70s and 80s, and certainly by the early 80s, I think almost nobody believed in it. Even the people who were in very privileged positions, perhaps them least of all, in those systems. And so then the question is, at what point did it stop being an ideal? And some people would say, well, actually, around 1918, right? Because, right, so you mentioned something like the land distribution, but again, the numbers of people who were murdered, right? And often innocent people. I mean, one of the big problems of that is that land becomes worthless if it's not being farmed. And what happened was that these economies, they just collapsed because the more feudal type of so-called kulak economy, right? Yeah, it was oppressive, it was class-based and everything, right, that a good socialist was supposed to hate. But it functioned. It functioned badly. It functioned oppressively. People didn't get primary education. They didn't get primary health care. So I'm not saying it was good, right? But a bad economy is an economy. It's very different from complete economic collapse and nothing to take its place, and then you get famines, right? And so so I don't deny that. And so I mean, what you really end up with was good intentions on the part of small numbers of people who were leading all of this, um, and therefore the real question that arises is that what revolution really is? Is it basically a small number of very educated people with very good intentions? I think we'll all agree on that, right? Um, who then, may or may not manage to mobilize a greater mass of people, but then it becomes something very different, right? Because, right, I mean, you were talking about, one of the big problems was that it became top heavy. I don't see how that could ever be avoided. Once you're talking about mass mobilization, which is supposed to take concerted action, right? The concertation doesn't happen spontaneously. Someone is going to lead, right? Because people just acting on themselves can't coordinate, right? And I guess another big problem is that um, I wonder what we can even do with the precedent of again, land distribution, which just became, again, state monopolization of a lot of unproductive land, right? With, again, lots of people made even poorer, if not just killed, for all sorts of reasons. But now, of course, today, land is not wealth in the way it was 100 or 200 years ago, right? At the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, land was still largely wealth. Um, but in right now we have, if 5% of an economy is agricultural, that's quite a bit, right? It seems to me, in several wealthy nations nowadays, it's maybe 2 or 3% of the whole economy is agriculture. Of course, it's very important. And again, even that is largely globalized. So, any given country can actually go through a few crop failures without necessarily the whole, without necessarily famines occurring, right? And so, wealth is something very different than it was in these periods when kind of the idea of leftist revolution was really underway, right? Again, I mean, even Marx, right, does understand, even, 19th century, right? He clearly saw that, that land was only part of the puzzle. And back then, of course, land was still an important part of wealth, and food production was more local and all of that. Today, right? Elon Musk probably in a historical comparison, probably does not own a lot of land. That is the least important part of his wealth and his power. And I would say this is probably true of almost everybody else who kind of, is currently possessing enormous amounts of wealth. And so then so redistribution means a completely different thing than it might have done, say, 100 or 200 years ago. I don't know if this helps.
No, it's good, but I want to see what Eduardo has to say. And also,
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've been back and forth between this because for a while since I have seen reformist legislation or movement or any sort of attempt to try to give the working class a better life, a better society, it becomes disappointing, and I see disillusionment constantly, especially from part of the young people. And if we look at percentages of people who are voting, I noticed that there are people who are getting further away from electoral politics because of the desire to have something new and change and fresh and hope. I remember in 2008, I remember being in one of the most biggest rallies in SF at students sitting down. It reminded me, I thought to myself, this is what probably the 60s looked like when they were looking for the future in a president. When I would see, we were in a very big place, I forget where it was, and in SF, and students were sitting at the balconies and holding onto the rails and watching down at, looking at Dr. Cornel West, really asking us all to vote for Obama. And it was hard because you had what the war that I had participated in 2003, the anti-war movement from the Bush years, and so many people wanted to leave that era, and Obama was supposed to be that savior, and then where he was given the Nobel Peace Prize, and everyone thought this African American president is finally going to be the change that America needs. And then everything falls away. It's like Guantanamo Bay still remained opened. We went into Syria. We continued the war on Afghanistan. It was not the change that I think a lot of my generation, which I'm a millennial, thought of. And here I am in Mexico. And then Bernie Sanders, I think, was that new renovation, that desire for a change. I'm in Mexico, and I look at all the murals and I look at the autonomous societies that are here, and I think to myself, is that possible? When I look at the Mexican Revolution and why it was started by Ricardo Flores Magón, who was an anarchist, and he would write these I've been reading some of his works, and they're just his works are not that difficult to read. They're not very academic. They're very straightforward and easy for obreros, which are the working class people in Mexico. And it struck something into the people, and thousands decided to join the revolution after 30 years of dictatorship from Porfirio Diaz. And because of land inequality, labor exploitation, and the lack of democracy, there was a split from all the factions that were trying to create this revolution. And I know that there was the corruption that happened afterwards. People wanted a systematic change, and yet they got another president. And here we have another democracy. And but there was the leftover peasants that wanted to create this revolution that still had and that still live on today. There are 4 autonomous societies in Mexico that decide not to allow state government to run their society, or allow the narcotraficantes, which are drug lords, to run their society, and they have taken up arms. And the most notable one has been Zapatistas, which in 1994, they've decided to take over cities and towns, not cities, towns in Chiapas, and they still run today, actually. And so I know that sometimes I get disillusioned and think to myself, oh my goodness, is it possible? But in the state of Mexico, they do run their society, and they've been doing so since 1994. They've emerged. We don't know. I don't know if they have been there before. I think they have, but as indigenous tribes, now it's uh, more of a modern society of a mixed people that are trying to live um, out of their government, that are run by councils. They have healthcare, education, and they do a bartering system. And they still have their anti-globalization message. They have their kids still learn about agroecology, and they learn how to protect themselves. Everyone has to learn how to use an arm. And I think back at the Stonewall, I was thinking in June, when we were because I was invited to go to Pride, I think back at Stonewall Inn, and I'm not sure if they would have been heard had there not been a clash between the police and the transgender women that were trying to really stand up for themselves. Because a lot of the peaceful protests have been, as we've seen, squashed, and thousands die. And such as we look at Gandhi's movement, I have admiration for a lot of it, but a lot of people did unfortunately get um, destroyed because of what they were trying to do peacefully, which I still admire, by the way. I try to practice my Vipassana meditation every day, and I consider myself to be in that Buddhist tradition path. But I don't know if I'm not a monk though, and I still think that there are emphasis on, for a revolution to happen, there must be some sort of protection, self-protection. And I see that as they try to run their society and their internal affairs, the Zapatistas currently today, they don't have one of the things that Andy brought up as far as state-run control. That's why these councils have to change constantly, so there won't be any uh, corruption or hierarchy that is going to overtake their power. So they do that constantly. I've been reading about it, so I have it here. They're made up of delegates from local communities, and in order to prevent hierarchy or corruption, members have to change frequently. That's why the biggest known person who was in the media, El Comandante Marcos, which everyone thought of, the Che Guevara of Mexico, is no longer in power because they can't have someone be there too long. Now it's a woman. So, I mean, they do make decisions through consensus or broad consultation, and they mediate conflicts, oversee projects, and coordinate among communities. I think obviously any tried or project like this is going to have its issues and internal conflicts. But I think one of many anarchist societies existing out there, it's one of the most admirable that I have found. And in a country like Mexico, which to some people might be considered third world country, I think it's telling. And when I think of my disillusionment, I'm here between, as a Mexican American person with 2 passports. I think to myself, Which one is it? Do we invest into electoral politics, or do we look at the South that are not actually run by intellectuals and academics, that are run by peasants and indigenous folk in the South, and that are being spied on by the government because they're too dangerous, these brown indigenous people? You know, that's the conflict I have, being in two worlds.
Eric,
Believe it.
first one.
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah. No, go ahead, Andy.
Oh, well, let me say where I have I'll use Eduardo's starting point and talk about some of the things that I have in common with what you said, which is when I do think of revolution, and I don't grapple with the notion of whether we are going to require, whether what's going to need to happen is reform or revolution. I keep getting reinforced by the system that it's going to have to be a revolution. But one of the things you said, that it can't be done by a small number of people, that's like that is not a throwaway statement. It's like, I can't conceive of any revolution that would be worth pursuing that didn't require the mass participation, not the mass voting of, or the mass like, yeah, we're with you, go do it. In my union, when I was involved in my union, the only things that really worked, that threatened our employers, was not when me and a set of 6 or 7 people spoke in the name of the workers we might have been representing, but when they felt like everyone was taking action. And yeah, there were people who you had to speak to as a leader and things like that, because that's who was the representative for that whole thing. But really, everyone was in motion. And so, I'm also, I think Eduardo's brought up the movements in the Chiapas as a starting point for, current possibly thinking about revolution. I think you said a number of things like, and I think there's gonna be people who say, wait, he said some stuff about the revolution, Eric, that you got to take on, and da da da. And I don't think I'm going to, just to say that whatever I have understood about the historical struggles in Russia or Spain or China, the parts of them that I think will need to be carried through are the parts that I believe have a mass, not just mass base to them, but a mass action to them. And not just a mass action that then voted for and then a few people decide, but are things what have been historically called dual power, new systems created that are alternatives to the existing system, like literally some other organization. And often we as leftists get caught up in the notion of violence or not violence when we think about, are we going to have to destroy this system, forgetting that any real revolution has to have has to have an alternative system in place that is the basis not of destroying the other system, but is the basis of defending that system. Like, the reason you're taking action is because you're defending this new system which is emerging, which I would say would have to have a mass base to it, which would have to require everyone's participation, essentially. And I don't mean like the people who don't participate are the people who want to keep the other system. And to the extent that it does do that is to the extent to which it could be, if you will, less violent. And one thing I'll mark out is, in terms of the Russian Revolution, I remember a thing about a movie talking about the Russian Revolution that tried to go over it. I remember hearing that, like, more people died in the making of the movie or something like that than the actual Russian Revolution itself, because the Soviets had already organized their own population, working class population, the Soviets in the form of the people in the military, so that basically it was just moving people aside, and very, very few people were killed in the actual formal taking out of the existing government. It was literally just a transition from one to another, from parliamentary rule to Soviet rule, and was able to be done relatively peacefully. Now, after that, when there's the counter revolution like that, that's a different story. But I do believe it's possible that when masses of people take action in their own name, and I believe it's both possible and necessary, that this kind of change could be done in a way that is not degrading, if you will, like that is not going to essentially make it so that people are like, PTSD because of all the crazy stuff they had to do, like soldiers who had to do stuff in Vietnam, or the soldiers who have gone into like Afghanistan and Iraq. Like people will feel like they were part of something liberatory, not part of something that was like, well, I had to go in there and just shoot a bunch of people, and now we have a revolution. And so that character, that part of what Eduardo's talking about in Chiapas, is the part that I think is crucial to the possibility of revolution. Even as I say, I think that possibility is a necessity. And if it doesn't happen, I do believe it will be the common ruin of contending classes. That I do believe through nuclear war or environmental destruction, I believe capitalism will make the globe unsustainable unless that kind of transformation takes place. Will that transformation happen? I don't know. And it will only happen if it has that mass character. And that's what I hope to be part of, if you will.
See, I think that one of the problems of mass action from entirely the grassroots is that it can create a power vacuum. And I think that's a bit of the problem that Eduardo was talking about at the beginning of his comments, right? Where all of a sudden, people are starting to grab power again. Eduardo, if I understood you correctly, because this is what happens when you create a power vacuum: is that somebody steps into it, right? I mean, we could come up with many examples. I think, to some degree, you could explain Donald Trump this way. But he's not the first, and so, see, I guess one of the things I struggle with is that sooner or later, any government, I mean, I think this is one reason why Eduardo talks about anarchy, is because any form of government, any governmental structure, is going to become oligarchical. It's oligarchical in the literal sense of rule by the few, no matter how it started out, right? Many people, again, people who just kind of are getting by day to day, working, taking care of their families, don't necessarily have a lot of time for much else. Are inevitably going to find themselves in an imbalance with people who then step into a power vacuum. And so I guess I don't know whether I'm being realistic or cynical or narrow-minded. So I guess I tend to aim more for how can we relatively distribute power as much as possible, right? The ideal would be distribution of power to everyone. Everyone plays a part in self-government, in collective self-government. And that's very hard. Again, particularly if you're dealing with people who, as a concrete matter, are just getting by day to day, even if things are improving for them. And even if under other circumstances they might want to participate, many people just won't. And particularly depending on the kind of society you're talking about. If you're talking about one that has a lot of technology, and right, if we're not talking about going back to a much more basic form of life, which also has problems, which was never a golden age, then yeah, you're going to have some people who, for whatever reason, aren't doing politics or can't do politics. And so that creates a vacuum, and a vacuum creates an oligarchy. And so I guess that's why I tend to say maybe we need to leave aside power equally distributed to everybody and look at something more like, well, okay, will things be generally well off if power is distributed enough, right? In other words, if the number one evil to avoid is just, any one or small number of people just getting much too much, which we're seeing on the increase in the world today, right? This is, I think, the part of the erosion of democracy itself is that democracy is very easy to hijack. right? Because again, you could say democracy itself creates power vacuums, and we're looking at, right. This is this is largely how I would explain someone like Donald Trump, but not only him, not only him. And so, if I can say a word in favor of Barack Obama,
How dare
it
you?
would be that. It would be that. It would be that. I guess.
Oh, Eduardo, you want to say something there?
No, Eric, why don't you finish your thought?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, sure,
Start
sure,
again.
sure. Yeah, I guess, and I will finish it here. I guess it would be that at least he comes from a tradition that I think, yeah, in a maybe a more modest, less ambitious, but maybe more practicable way, does represent. Let's try to. We can't perfectly distribute power, but let's try to maximize the loci of power so nobody ever gets too much, which might explain why his presidency was very different from Donald Trump's. Why it was at least relative, still a very powerful presidency, but relatively more deferential, more cooperative. Even though you're probably going to think I'm just a sellout. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Edward.
No, you're fine.
Hey,
I
first, Eduardo, I have to denounce Eric as a sellout, so I got to do that.
Eric, I think about what you said about people wanting to live their day-to-day lives. Recently there were these protests in LA, and so many people that I thought would not be. I've a circle of friends that I'm in contact with, and they all mostly are people who would not be involved in politics. And then suddenly I see movement happening across the nation recently because of the ICE raids. And people who I never thought would be involved in politics are participating because their families are being torn apart. And I'm just amazed at former high school students, former high school classmates of mine who cared less about politics, involved in protesting, in making emergency calls, organizing, involved with already existing unions, which is also a problem to me because I think that some of those unions are actually sort of backed by some of the more liberal and neoliberal groups. But anyhow, they didn't know where to exert that energy, which I think if they only organized better, they would form new ones, which would be more radical. But the point is, they became involved because they saw their families being ripped apart, and they knew their parents could not be out there protesting because they didn't have papers, so they undocumented and the scare of it. But they were involved. I saw that movement in 2020. I went to the Black Lives Matter protests, and across the nation, I saw people involved. Other friends that are African American that were not a part of politics also involved. In 2011, when I was part of the Occupy movement, I saw people, white middle class folk who are being foreclosed because of their housing, because of the housing crisis, also involved. And then in 2003, I remember being part of the anti-war movement, and I saw people who did not care about politics join so many people across the world as well because of they didn't want to be a part of another war and the economic concerns of getting involved in another war. And then I go to Florida, and my best friend, who is a Trump supporter, they are involved in the 6th of January, even though I do not think that that is my agenda, the thing that I saw there at the 6th of January was how many people were involved because they're not involved, and they're not involved in politics, but they were invested in getting in protecting their status for someone they thought was their savior, or they think, many of them just maybe still think, because of they believed in Trump protecting their economic concerns, the anti-globalized sentiment, which is the first America First message that Trump was able to win them by, and the cultural scare of immigration, and this whole cultural and identity politics culture against them. And specifically, I know Trump supporters that got involved. And I thought, why weren't they involved before? And I look at all these groups and I think to myself, here are people who have lived day to day and have no interest in voting, and they're so involved at these moments. And why aren't they all united in order for us to be collectively together? Like, this is why I think, I don't know how they don't see the separation that has been done to them by the elite class and by the ruling class specifically, that is trying to keep us separated. But when you see people's desire to be involved, and not at the ballot box, but rather on the streets, I think to myself, is that possible? Is it possible? What do the Zapatistas have? I don't know, and I'm still trying to. I've struggled with it, and I've shared it on What's Left so many times. What made the Zapatista movement so unison, which they were able to invest in healthcare, invest in education, not depend on the government, have to have a militant government in order to protect themselves from the narco state and from the state itself, the government. And so if their needs are met, they're not going to be thinking, how do I put food on the table? Because collectively, their people are putting that food on the table so that they can also have the education they need to protect their autonomous society. So I understand when you say that. I constantly wonder if we would be able to unite all those movements that I've thought about, that I mentioned. And it is scary that, one movement here, one movement there, but there isn't, I see, a collective desire to be united, so to speak. But you're right. Are people invested in something like that? If their day-to-day is to put food on the table, have a good life, find escapism by going out, going on vacation, is that possible when people are trying to survive? Suddenly I'm baffled when I see people I never thought were involved get involved. Um, you know,
Yeah, and of course, I mean, what kind of comforts are we all willing to give up? And, particularly now that, we live our whole lives through devices, right? All of this places enormous power in small numbers of extremely powerful companies, in addition to the government, right? Because we know that the big tech companies are more powerful now than most governments on the planet. And Eduardo, I mean, it's funny. I thought I had an answer to you until you brought up January 6th. Because before you brought that up, I guess the image that came into my mind was, I'm not so worried about the progressive instincts of people in LA and Chicago and New York. Wondering about everywhere else, what's long been called Middle America.
mm,
Um, and the fact that, you see, one of the big problems, today, as opposed to, say, leftism of 100 or 200 years ago, is that, is there any meaning to the concept of working class? You have now these mass middle classes, some of whom are often still struggling, again, struggling in some ways even more precisely because of the need to keep up with, have a car and have, computers and have the kids have the right level, right? And all these other things, uh, which also, I think, make it even harder for people to become civically active because they're just exhausted at the end of the day.
yeah.
And so it's different, I guess. And so then you kind of trip me up a bit with the January 6th.
Well, you
But
know
I guess,
why?
but I guess my problem, I'll just finish.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think my problem there is that I don't think I have a lot of skepticism about anybody unifying with an ethno-nationalist movement,
Of course, yeah.
because that defines itself as exclusive, as us and them.
I,
I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
no, I think I know what you mean. I think back. You're in England, right? I
Yeah.
lived there I was living in Camelford, in Cornwall, and I was talking to miners down there, and then they told me about the miners' strike during Thatcher.
Sure.
And something that I was impacted by my time in England, because I was working with this with not organization. It's not really an organization. It was a group, a small circus group that would travel with the music festivals to give The music festival scene in the UK is just amazing, and I loved how I was able to work with them. And what I was struck by was so many of those hippies that are not like US American hippies, where they were actively involved in protests such as the miners' strike. And the miners' strike was supported by the LGBT movement that created a coalition between very conservative miners and LGBT activists that were completely on different ends. And that coalition, that desire to support and be amongst one another was difficult. And I have heard so many stories about the difficulties of trying to have these conservative traditionalists work with LGBT folk, but then in that working together, they were able to discover something else for themselves, where they were able to then accept people that would otherwise be bullied or marginalized. And I think about that support and that shared struggle, where they together faced police violence and they were able to fight against that state oppression under Thatcher. So that gives me hope, I suppose, and I'm trying not to get emotional about it. But the stories that they shared with me, I think could give us a lesson about political ideologies and divisions coming together to create a transformation where we could find common ground and slowly repair a lot of that hurt. I don't know if I feel as comfortable sometimes when I think of Trump supporters tearing apart families and the desire for it. They're not tearing apart families, but the support of their leader trying to tear apart families, and they being brainwashed to think that that is the boogeyman, And I talk to these communities and I say, it's always the war on drugs, it's the terrorists, it's health scares, it's immigration. You have to look at these boogie people that the government is trying to put in front of you and have that conversation. But you're right, Eric, when you think of the 6th of January, is that our political movement? It's hard to swallow, but that's why I look at history. I look at history and the miners' strike during Thatcher years.
And just to add one thing, I think, because I agree with the way Eduardo characterized it, but I think what he was bringing up was the notion of, you kind of described people as possibly like helium, unreactive and not willing to go into action. And he's looking at these different moments when people who were helium 2 weeks ago became hydrogen, became, like something that was willing to go into action. Do we agree or even agree with where they're going? We don't. But I think both he and I look at movements on the left and the right as at least being animated by, well, to the extent that we support them, by something independent of their rulers. And if it's not, there's not much there then. But it shows us that people are willing to go into action. And you raised a very important critique of the possibility of revolution. Are people willing to go into action? And we say they have been for short periods of time. Could you go longer? And I think that's one of the other reasons he's bringing up January 6th, is just to say it doesn't just happen on the left, it happens on the right. People who were never doing anything suddenly take on something. And as you know, Trump and the Republican Party wanted to use January 6th for whatever they do. Also, the Democrats did as well. And as we're seeing with the immigrant rights movement, the fight against ICE, things like No Kings and the trade unions and the Democratic Party want to come in and take that over as well. So you'll always have these people from above who want to take control of that sentiment and direct it back underneath them. But we're saying, what if it retained its independence? What if it stayed away from the power rulers who are trying to use it? Could those movements possibly be brought together? A movement like January 6th, which has a basis in it we organized with some of those people around when we were opposed to the lockdown measures and things like that. We became in contact with people on the right, and we saw how committed they seemed at the time to anti-state measures, to the state not coming in and being able to impose itself on you. But we have also seen how those same people have now been manipulated to empower the state to attack immigrants who 2 years ago were saying, no, don't come at us. I'm very familiar with people in the Democratic Party being completely hypocritical and saying, I don't want George Bush bombing people in the Middle East. I want Obama to be doing it. So I'm very familiar with that hypocrisy. I have now seen that, people on the right can also be hypocritical, right? They can say they oppose the state and those state measures, which I support that opposition, and then find themselves suddenly being pulled into in another lever with another switch job. Oh, state, empower yourself to attack immigrants, and using surveillance and fourth industrial and like the things you're talking about, data collection and things like that, that will ultimately be used against them. Here at What's Left, we find ourselves in this place kind of stuck between both halves, trying to say, look, folks, we believe you ultimately all want the same thing. You might not agree with that, Eric, but I think I do. But you're going to have to kind of find a way to overcome some of those political divisions or ethnic divisions if it's going to be a possibility. And that's why I think we talk about ICE resistance and January 6th in some ways in the same way.
Mm.
And I think the Thatcher Party is a conservative party that miners supported initially. But when they realized they were being attacked even by their own party, the Conservative Party, they thought they had a realization that they weren't actually looking for their interests. So I hope that one day maybe MAGA supporters will also see that they're being their conservative or their Republican Trump's Trump leader isn't actually looking out for their interests as well. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle, and I see it constantly in my battles with people who are on that right. Anyhow, I these are all thoughts in my head. I don't know if I have any cohesion.
Well, incidentally, there's been just about a week ago, there was a recent update, I think, to this kind of story. I don't know whether it made the headlines in the US, because I think in the US you're all very busy with lots of other stuff right now. But there was a kind of a minor historic event. And certainly kind of the first bit of good news for a very long time, which was Budapest Pride. Because I don't know if you've been to a few pride marches, usually they're pretty much the same, and but I mean, I don't think I'm romanticizing or exaggerating here. I think many observers from different countries noticed that this became far more than just another pride march. This was a pro-democracy march, an anti-Orban march, right? Anti all of this autocratic politics, that this whole machine that he's built, and that you see elsewhere in Europe as well, either in power or trying to get power. It was a march against all of that, and very clearly so. And certainly has a few echoes with some of the stories that you've just told. Lots of people saying, I never thought I would come to this kind of march. Some saying, I never paid attention. Others say, almost showing a mild distaste, and yet happy to be there, happy to talk to the cameras, even. So I think this is a nice update to this kind of story where so you had people essentially across the spectrum, because plenty of people who had been Orban supporters, and they just can't even look at the guy anymore. He's just become so hideous at every level, so corrupt, so vicious, and so forth. But then the question is, what were they marching for? I can tell you a lot about what they were marching against, because it's always easier to be against, right? So it's easy to be against COVID lockdown. It's easy to be against the ICE agents. It's easy to be against Viktor Orban, right? You see the impact, you see the corruption, so you know what you're against. What were these people for in Budapest? I think they were actually for something that we would call democracy, and respect for individual freedoms. And I think that kind of gets us back to our original theme.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the stories, as we put these stories together, they're more about reform than revolution, but maybe it's just that that's the way I want to read it. So maybe that's me just forcing these stories, you know?
It's a good question, Eric. I wonder about that. When I was part of the Occupy movement,
Yeah.
uh, that was, I think, largely why we didn't survive,
Mm.
because we didn't have a common goal. We didn't fight for something. We were against something.
Yeah.
And I think the only last stand of the Occupy movement was, I see my cat trying to enter the house and he's at the window. He's tired of being outside. Uh, I think the only thing that was last ending was in Seattle. There was a campment, and that took over, I think, even the police station. And all they kept doing was fighting, 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 but they didn't build something. They were fighting against. They didn't build something for. And I think that was largely what disintegrated the Occupy movement. Um, that's, I think, a fair criticism.
Well,
Mm.
and literally, Eric, as you said, when you said we were the statements you were making bring us back to this question of reform or revolution. You literally said it as I was thinking, like, wait, we've returned to like the question, like, and it's reanimated me to know that we have. I believe that a movement has to keep that question in front of itself, and has to find a way of having that discussion in a way where discussing it doesn't blow us up, doesn't just, create the new divisions. Because I do think unity is going to be a big piece of true unity, not like, okay, I'm the leader, now you must all unify under my leadership. But actual people having different views, ideas, but saying, I'm willing to set this aside to be part of this. I'm willing to set that aside to be part of this because I feel like this thing is building something that I believe in. And it's building something that I believe will help us in the long run. And I also will say that the reason people do that is not because Andy will say so or Eric will say so or Eduardo might say it's doing that, but they feel like it's happening. And I do believe that, like, we do live under capitalism. That's my belief. Like, that's the system that run it. And I believe in the way that Rosa Luxemburg talked about reform or revolution, that one of the bases of the possibility of revolution is the fact that capitalism is a crisis driven system, and that those crises are getting worse and worse and worse each season, from 2010 to 2020 to the next business cycle. That growing crisis leads to, in our case, global wars, World War I, World War II, and what I believe is we are already in it, but World War III. And so it is the collapse of that existing system. And really, and if you look at Germany, people in Germany initially were supporting World War I, but once the body count starts, you can start to see that initial support, even by the socialists, for entering World War I, turned into its opposite. I worry sometimes that the body count in World War III will be so quickly happening because of the nature of war has been changed, that we don't get the chance to learn the hard lesson that we have no alternative but revolution, which is what I think happened in Germany. I do also think what's happened in Russia at that time, which is, I do believe people are trying to find any alternative to the hard work of revolution, but they are forced to it because the system says, look, we're willing to kill you in millions in order for us to retain power. And people have to learn that hard lesson of what their rulers are, and in fact that they don't. And I think this is true. I don't believe we live in a democracy. I believe we have a democratic veneer that really is a dictatorship of corporate rule, oligarchic rule, and state rule. That is my belief, as well. But I would say that the possibility of revolution will not come as a result of a power vacuum. I sometimes do a little thought experiment to myself, and I said, if Marxist aliens came down and removed the ruling classes and said, okay, you're liberated, we're taking the ruling classes out, the capitalists, we're removing them for you, that it would be a mess, because I do believe, and that's kind of what I mean. It didn't have, when you think about the Paris Commune, like the French were ruling, Germans took them out, Germans left, and then you had a kind of power vacuum that allowed that commune to form. That's not going to be the way I think people are made fit to rule. I believe that the way people will be made fit to rule their own lives is the necessity of having to overcome the intellectual and physical divisions we have in order to build something new, and in order to defend it against the people who want to keep the old system in place. And it's that training ground, which I don't know how long that training ground lasts. Does it last 5 years? Does it last 20 years? Does it last a generation or 2 generations? I tend to think of revolutions as taking a time, but then going very quickly. So I could think of it as happening over a 5 or a 10-year period. But the possibility of revolution does require the actual transformation of people through doing their own liberation. If that doesn't happen, then it's a wrap. It can't happen. You can't get it just by removing the problem. People have to be part of that solution. And in being part of the solution, that is where I hold the hope of revolution in that.
Well, I think you both sort of mentioned, this problem of every now and then comes a moment, of unity and mobilization in a constructive way. And then the problem is holding on to it and keeping it from fizzling out. Now that's where I think this question of unity comes in. And that's why I said, it's always easy to be against something, right? But to be for, right, against something that you have evidence of. To be for something is to be making guesses about the future, which is a much harder thing to do, and is a much harder thing to agree on. And I guess where I have a bit of skepticism is, so we can people can unify against what they don't like, against an identified evil, to use a simple word. Unity going forward, I think, is a much harder proposition, and that's where, again, if power does not stay well distributed, that's where you get the power back in. Unity becomes someone imposing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this has been the tragedy of revolutions, even when, revolutions that started out, again, even if they were led by smaller numbers, led by people who were, for lack of a better word, enlightened, progressive, right, and thought that they could bring others with them, and often could, right? But then, in order to keep from fizzling out, the things start to become coercive. I think and that's why, for me, the word unity always makes me shiver a bit, because I know it's, in politics, it's always a positive word. But for me, the prospect of unity becoming just a nice word for coercion, has a lot of historical traction.
Yep.
I always tell my students, not only students, by the way, every now and then, at this or that lecture, wherever, the most exclusive word in the English language is we.
Can you say more about that? Why you say that?
Yeah, I'm always, I mean, ever since I was a kid, actually, the word we always makes me nervous. We believe, we think, we want, right? Maybe that's probably why I can never get along with anybody. And why I tend to be skeptical about revolutions. Because again, I agree with you. You can get a revolutionary impulse, again, usually mustered around an existing foe or force, right? But going forward without keeping unity, but without coercion, is where my skepticism kicks in.
I agree with that. And I think I understand what you mean by we, and I think I've had the same response to it, because usually somebody is saying we, but I'm like, does that include me? Like, I'm not sure. And if it does, maybe I'm fine with it. But what about the people who it doesn't include? Like, that's a really interesting point.
Well, I think you had kind of mentioned last time around, that this was a problem that you had run into, among progressives, and all of a sudden, where you're saying, "Wait a minute, I'm not sure I agree with that point," and you're completely excluded. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and that is a very coercive we. And I went by coercive. I don't necessarily mean, that they were putting a gun to your head. They didn't
Oh,
need to. They were able to exclude you without doing that,
with such a
right? Social pressure is always greater, really, or usually. It's always very, very powerful. And so I guess that's where my apprehension about the revolutionary ideal comes from. Not that you can't find a cause, but about uniting around a future. And that's where the word unity makes me nervous.
Yep. That's a good point.
How's your cat, Eduardo?
I was looking for him, but I think he gave up now. Sorry, I apologize.
He
I
found a
really.
mouse. He found a mouse, and isn't that the history of humanity too?
Oh
Well,
Lord.
I think as we wrap up, I think you've left me wondering, Eric, what makes some some revolutions last, even though they might be small, we might not even consider them to be revolutions, such as the revolution here in the Zapatistas. What makes them continue keeping them alive? There has to be something, and I think at further exploration, I'd like to actually look at that and an episode, Andy, that we do. But you're right, and as I think it's a critical, fair point, uh, and once there's it's like a roller coaster. Once there's momentum, and then there is this climatic point, and then suddenly we see the downfall of it in many movements, such as the ones that I brought up. Um, I don't think there will be 100% unity in any movement, such as the ones that I brought up, the miners' strike and the LGBT community. But in their coexistence, they were able to find ways to work together. And so,
And one of the
anyhow,
ways, I'll just say one of the ways that I think about that, having spent much of my time on what's called the formal left, I don't really think of things in terms of left and right any longer. I do think of them in terms of reform or revolution. Like, are you revolutionary? Are you reformist? And reformist is such a bad word. Well, revolutionary is a bad, but both of those are good things because it's. I mean, what I think is good is people trying to figure out how do we make the world better, and that's a question of how they see that happening. But I do believe that when you talk about a left, you're often talking about people who use terms like we and unity. When you're talking about a right, you talk about people who are talking about individual freedom and liberty. And I actually believe that a riddle that will need to be solved by the kind of revolution that I'm fighting for is one that deals with the connection between unity and individual liberty and finds some sort of they got to be connected somehow. And it has to solve a kind of riddle that counterposes those. And that's one of the things I wonder if that can be done. So those are some ways I think about the things you just raised about the problem of we, or the fact that every time my union president would sign off his notes in unity, I myself was a little nervous. Like, wait a second, dude, what do you mean? And he did it, I do believe, for the exact reasons you're talking about, not to actually, well, you know what I mean. So it's been a very interesting discussion. So I'm really glad we did this.
Well, yeah. Thank you very much also for having me back.
Eric, you've given us a lot of food for thought. And you
Well, I think all three of us have nourished each other's intellects. I certainly feel that way. I hope.
And just
yeah.
to say that for What's Left, we felt when we started What's Left back in 2018, it was in a left that was really unwilling to brook division, that was going to enforce a we. And we felt it, although we didn't identify it in the way that you just talked about it in this episode. But one of the things we wanted to overcome was a fake we and make a real we. And can a real we come from actually hearing where we disagree and not just lose our minds over those disagreements?
Yeah.
So I'm glad we could discuss this today.
Yes. And I'm now off to have a real wee.
All right, let's conclude.
That's not going to get edited. That's
all right. Here we go. Because otherwise, yes. So,
Otherwise, I'll bring down the level even further, I'm sure.
yeah. Potty jokes. Holy shit! I didn't realize we're going to get there.
here we go. That does it for this week's episode. Eric Heinze is Professor of Law and Humanities at Queen Mary University of London, known for his sharp analysis of free speech, human rights, and political theory. His books include The Most Human Right and Hate Speech and Democratic Citizenship, and his writing appears in outlets like The Guardian and Eon, and many more. His new book is Coming Clean, The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left. We'll post a link to that episode where we discussed it with him. Thank you. And what's left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode, or on our blog at whatsthappodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you have heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes, Podcast, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, or Telegram. You can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes wherever you found this episode. And lastly, if you would like to give us feedback, such as some folks have, about something you've heard, or suggest something for us to cover, such as some listeners have, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Andy Lipson. Thank you so much for being with us, Ericans. We appreciate you coming back, and we expect to have a future episode at some point with you again. Thank you all for listening. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.